Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I see some folks still trickling on in, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining today. My name is Keith Groom, and I'll be your host today. I lead the global Windows partner business for AWS, based out of Seattle. I'm joined by by Louis Molina, one of our senior solution architects on the partner team with deep expertise in enterprise infrastructure. My team's focus is helping partners develop the capability and capacity and expertise to migrate and modernize Microsoft workloads on AWS. AWS is a great platform for Windows workloads, but it's a very specific, unique skill set, a set of specific architecture best practices. I'm really excited today to bring you 3 stories from around the world from customers that have migrated and modernized their Microsoft workloads on AWS. I'll be sharing some insights from their journey and reviewing some of the key benefits and outcomes that they've been able to achieve. Feel free to type your questions into the chat window. We will be answering them mostly as we go. We'll stop at a couple sections in today's webinar and take those questions as we see them come in. Note that we are going to start with a brief video that highlights the benefits of running Microsoft workloads. It's kind of fun, it's short. If you've dialed into the call, you may not hear the audio. You have to be dialed in from the computer. So with that, Brittany, let's roll the video, please. I don't know why that sound always makes me smile. Might be a little bit over the top, but it's fun nevertheless. So for our first story, we're going to go to Japan and talk about Fileforce, a leading ISV out of Japan. So next slide, please. As I mentioned, Fileforce is a full SaaS-based ISV running on AWS, headquartered out of Tokyo, Japan. They provide a cloud-based file storage and document management service to more than 300 customers worldwide. They have this cloud-based platform that customers can securely store and manage their business content in the same folder structure as their on-premise file storage solutions. And they're a bit of a unicorn in many respects, because in Japan, if you know the market there, most ISVs, according to IDC, 80% are still on-premise. Fileforce is operating as a full SaaS ISV running on AWS. So let's dive into that journey a little bit. It started back in 2014, and like many software companies, they were running in a local data center, and they were having to manage all of the hardware for their software application. They were running out of capacity. They were buying racks of server. They were buying racks that had the Microsoft licensing included in them. They didn't have a separate enterprise agreement. And it was difficult and expensive to add that capacity, and they felt like they were, frankly, becoming a data center operator, not software developers. They were having latency and reliability issues, and they were only able to do 3 or 4 updates per year because of the time involved to develop and test and move to production, and they didn't have development automation in place. At the time, they were running a .NET-based application with Windows Server and SQL Server, like many ISVs. And they started to evaluate Azure versus AWS at the time, and they simply found AWS to be much more stable than Azure. And they also liked the fact that AWS allowed more control over the services than Azure did, and their developers felt it was easier to use. They conducted a pilot, which was successful, and they did a full migration to AWS. And one of the things they really like about the AWS platform is the auto scaling and auto load balancing, because their customer workloads and these storage workloads can vary. They're able to just react very quickly with auto scaling, auto load balancing on AWS that they just were not effectively able to do in an on-premise data center. So allowing them to achieve greater reliability and lower latency. What they also did was they migrated their SQL Server database to Amazon Aurora RDS. So Amazon Aurora is a fully managed database offering created by AWS, no licensing involved, and this dramatically lowered their licensing expenses. And also it gave them this managed database and that they did no longer have to manage themselves directly. And their .NET application, they've been migrating it to .NET Core over time. And what's interesting is they chose to do it in steps. So as a module needed an update, they would rewrite that code from .NET to .NET Core. And this reduced their risk and allowed them to innovate at their own pace. They develop in Visual Studio and they use JetBrains as their IDE. And by moving to .NET Core, they've been able to automate up to 90% of their code deployment and can push code updates each week instead of once a month or once every couple of months. And once they were on .NET Core, they were also able to move from Windows Server license included to Linux servers, which is also reducing their cost by 30%. And they're investing those savings into growing their customer base. And next up, they're now exploring how to use containers and serverless to add additional automation into their software platform. And the other benefit they've seen is that they're able to have multiple versions of their software customized for individual customers. And this was simply not possible for them to maintain these different versions of software in that on-premise world. And the AWS platform is enabling that. Recently, when there was an outage in Japan, because they designed their application using AWS well-architected principles, which means they architected into a multiple AZ structure, they experienced no downtime at the time, and that really has surprised them. I had the chance to meet Aram, their CEO, last year when I was visiting partners in Japan. And one of the key benefits he told me that his company has achieved because of moving to AWS is that their culture has changed. And they've now embraced cloud throughout their business and in their office, not just on their infrastructure side. And it's freed them to be more agile from their office and their data center. And the culture in Japan is most people still go to an office. The remote work at home is not as common in Japan as it is throughout the rest of the world. And so they're really able to do something unique, and they're a real leader in their industry in Japan. And so what I'm taking away from this story is how they've been able to achieve reliability, scale, and performance. It just wasn't possible in their on-premise data center. How they've modernized from .NET to .NET Core over time, and they did it at their own pace and in pieces, and that was the right approach for them. They've also moved from SQL Server to Aurora, completely getting off Microsoft licensing and products that's enabling them to have a fully open source architecture to expand in the future. So love that story. And now we're going to stay on that side of the world, but head a little further south and go down to Brisbane, Australia. So if we could go to the next slide. And we're going to talk about how Redcat is using AWS. So next slide, Brittany. For this second story, Redcat is headquartered in, as I mentioned, Melbourne, Australia. And they're an IT platform in the hospitality industry. So think cafes, bars, and restaurants. And they're really unique. They specialize in multi-site locations, i.e. franchise locations, and they offer this end-to-end solution, including the POS terminals and entry devices, to include a best-in-breed cloud-based platform that integrates with many third-party solutions in their industry. And their portfolio of solutions include things like a loyalty marketing platform, online ordering and delivery, point-of-sale management, hardware, financials, and integration. If you've ever visited Nando's or Boost Juice or Chat Time or Garvish, in Australia, you would have used their system. And prior to migrating to AWS, Redcat was hosting their solution in an on-premise data center, similar to Fileforce. And their infrastructure consisted of a mix of Windows and Linux platforms. Their data center was very old school. They had no scaling, they had fixed drives, and the demands of the customer was they were choking because of the demands of the customers. The data center could not scale to meet their needs. And they were constantly worried about capacity for their customers, because if Boost Juice wanted to drop a coupon to their users, they would have to plan this anticipated upswing in usage in the data center, and procuring that additional capacity was expensive and difficult and time consuming. This was creating real reliability issues for their customers. And they had situations where their data center provider would have a maintenance window requiring several hours of downtime that was unplanned that they'd have to react to. And they said they need to make a change. And AWS opened the region in Australia, and at the time they looked at Azure and AWS and started an evaluation. And one of the things they looked at was they felt AWS supported both Linux and Windows better than Azure. They felt Azure was very strong for Windows workload, but had some gaps supporting Linux. But also they found that AWS supported Windows fine. There wasn't any issue with running the Windows workloads on AWS. So this was an important consideration. They were moving forward, going to have this multiple platform of Windows and Linux, and they wanted to make sure their cloud provider could support that. And they found they really liked how the auto scaling, auto load balancing worked with AWS, as well as the managed database offering. Again, another commonality that we saw in the Fileforce story, that ability to load balance and auto scale. So when their customers want to run a loyalty campaign, they needed to be able to quickly scale up to meet their customer demand. So they migrated their Linux environment to AWS, and then they engaged an AWS Premier consulting partner, Rackspace, to assist them with the Windows migration. While their team had a good knowledge of AWS, Rackspace had a deeper understanding of Windows workloads and how to migrate them. And they felt more comfortable having a partner with that level of expertise. Rackspace, this was a very large project involving hundreds of machines. And what surprised them is Rackspace was able to migrate them to AWS with 100% uptime. They're really surprised by that. Not something they ever would have experienced in their on-premise data center. Now they're running on AWS and they're seeing tremendous benefits. So now that when one of their customer wants to drop a coupon, say to 50,000 of their loyalty customers, they're able to do that campaign immediately compared to having to plan that campaign over 24 hours or even several days to keep their servers from crashing in the old world. Now they can just scale up immediately and get their customers running these automated campaigns. With the ease of integrating on AWS, the other thing they've been able to do is they're capturing the point of sale information. They then are now through APIs on AWS able to directly feed that back into their customers' data analytics platforms, whether running on AWS or not. And this is one of many integrations they just could not do when they were running on their old provider's infrastructure. And this is enabling the marketers within their customer base have a whole new set of freedom to innovate. Redcat is a leader in their space, and their solution is enabling their customers to be innovative in theirs. An example of this is one of their customers recently won a digital marketing award for innovation as a result of using Redcat's platform. This is how they're adding value to their customers. Marketers don't care about the technology platform. They're just interested in what's possible. And if Redcat wasn't able to support their customers this way, they would lose business. And one of the services that's proven invaluable to them is Amazon CloudWatch. Amazon CloudWatch allows them to monitor events and logs in real time, pinpoint problems, and allow them to more quickly troubleshoot where the root of the problem is. They're using a managed service from Rackspace to help them do much of this managed service, this monitoring and event and log management as issues comes up. They never had this kind of analysis in an on-premise environment. And one of the things they said to us was that it was really important that AWS had a data center in Australia for data sovereignty, and they looked for that as they look to expand around the world. And they are actually advertising to their customers they run on AWS, and this has given their customers confidence that Redcat can scale and support those customers' businesses, because this type of industry, you're dropping these kinds of campaigns and demands very quickly, and you get very spiky workloads, and having this cloud-based architecture allows them to respond really well. So a couple of takeaways, I think, for this story. You heard a similar vein around reliability and performance that just wasn't possible in their on-premise data center. AWS is well suited for this mixed environment if you've got Windows and Linux. And AWS has really strong tools to help them troubleshoot problems as they will come up, and they do come up. All right, we are going to head to our third story. Next slide, please. Now, Visma is a really interesting story. And this is going to take us to Oslo, Norway. And Visma is an AWS partner that provides human resources and financial management applications delivered as a software as a service model to over 1 million customers in Europe. They have 10,000 employees across 20 countries, and they operate in a broad range of industries. And so, like Fileforce, they've moved to a completely SaaS software as a service model on AWS. It's really freed them to do an amazing amount of innovation. So with that, Brittany, let's roll the video.
Visma is a top software company in Europe. We deliver SaaS-based financial and accounting and other types of software to 1 million customers across Europe. We had several challenges related to our use of private clouds. One of them was that development and operations worked very inefficiently. We were only able to update our cloud solutions about 6 times a year. We migrated from the database, we migrated from Microsoft SQL to an open source based database service, and we cut the cost in half. We have now configured automated scaling on the AWS platform, which means that we scale up when the systems are used more by customers, so they get increased performance, and we scale down when the systems are not as heavily used, and then we don't have to pay for resources that are not needed. One of the most important capabilities that we got out of the AWS platform was the self-service. Because of all the automation possibilities that the AWS platform has given us, we are able to automate many parts of our development process, which means that we are able to deploy changes to production more frequently than we were able to do before. After migrating to AWS and implementing continuous delivery and DevOps, we now update our cloud services about 6 times a month on average. One example of a service we built on AWS is a route optimization service. So healthcare workers in Norway, when they visit patients at home that need care, they can calculate their driving route through this application. This means that the healthcare workers can spend less time in traffic and more time at home with these patients. Using CloudFormation, we're able to define our entire infrastructure as code, which has many benefits. We are now able to have our infrastructure under version control. This means we can do code reviews of our infrastructure changes just as we do for our application changes. We have many workloads that we are aiming to modernize by moving to AWS. We want to improve reliability, performance, and scalability. We want to see where we can use container technology and serverless technology to benefit both Visma and our customers.
That's great. I love that story. I got a chance to meet Alexander in Vegas last November at our reInvent conference where he was speaking about their story. And when I talked to him, it's really interesting how he described, they had their own data center, and pretty typical model back then. They had DevOps and operations as separate teams. It's a big challenge. So developers would have to submit a ticket to the operations to obtain more servers or services, wait to hear back. There was this approval process, this feedback loop. You'd have some finger pointing when something went wrong. And this just meant that they could only push code updates a few times a year, and their infrastructure was limiting their ability to innovate. And they had to think differently about how to solve this problem. And they really wanted to bring developers and operations together to implement this modern DevOps practices that he mentioned in the video. And there was a number of decisions that drove, or factors rather, that drove their decision to AWS. And you heard Alex highlight this notion of self-service and the ability to have control over the services. And they really wanted to leverage the automation capabilities on AWS. And as you heard, after they implemented CI, continuous innovation, continuous delivery, they're now updating their software 6 times a month. So they were like a lot of customers we see. They had a legacy .NET application running in a data center, and they wanted to re-architect that to .NET Core onto Linux servers. Very common pattern that we see. And then you heard him say they moved from SQL Server to Amazon Aurora, and that cut their database costs in half. And in their instance, they were buying SQL Server licensing under an enterprise agreement, very expensive model. And by moving off a commercial database and that licensing model, they had a huge cost savings that's enabled them to innovate more rapidly. They can push code faster, and they continue to look at ways to automate their services. Like Fileforce and Redcat, they also use CloudWatch for monitoring. And this has enabled their developers to become more intimate with the infrastructure systems. Now the developers are responsible for service delivery. And as you heard him say, they're now exploring how to more deeply use containers and serverless technology like Lambda on AWS. So some real common themes through some of these design patterns. And so now we're going to shift to the next phase of the webinar, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why the AWS services enable some of these capabilities that we just heard about. So if we can go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to first start with, excuse me, go ahead and go to the next slide. I think it's important that we have millions of active customers, more customers than any other cloud provider. And at this stage, we now have customers in every market segment and every industry, from the startup to the enterprise to the public sector. But we've also developed a really strong systems integrator, SI, and ISV ecosystem that are supporting these workloads. Our customers want to use the software they use in the cloud, and so our ISVs are really critical to that. But as it relates to Windows, almost 70% of our customers use a consulting partner to help them migrate their journey. Nobody's doing it alone. The vast majority don't do it alone. So I really encourage you to look at our partner ecosystem, find a local partner in your market, and they will help you move your Microsoft workloads to AWS. Next slide, please. So there's really a couple of core areas that really determine why customers are choosing us. And some of it was highlighted in the videos, but AWS supports the full stack of Windows, Active Directory, .NET, SQL Server, Visual Studio. We also have unique capabilities such as FSX for Windows File Server, a fully managed native Windows File Server system. We also have managed Active Directory, and we're the only cloud provider to have something called a dedicated host where you can BYOL your license to your own dedicated servers in our cloud. Reliability turns out matters to customers, and I'm going to talk a little bit more deeper about why the platform is more reliable. And you've also heard just tremendous performance. We're seeing with SQL, and I'm going to talk through one of our studies, a 2x performance compared to Azure around SQL. And we've got just tremendous experience in this space, and we just continue to innovate at a rapid pace. So you go to the next slide, please. One of the things that is really important around Windows workloads is this idea of matching the right instance size and type to the workload, so that if you need a memory optimized instance or a compute optimized instance or a graphic optimized instance, we have 43% more choices than Azure. This just means you can get better performance at a lower cost for your application with licensing right size, particularly if you're going to do a BYOL licensing model. We have significantly more database services than Azure, and tremendous more management services, the ability to manage these workloads that sit in the cloud. And we in fact have 48 services that just don't even exist on Azure or GCP, that there's no comparable reference. And so this choice of tools, developers want and builders want the right tool for the right job. And so we're really pleased to be able to offer so many different tools and services to help customers optimize their workloads on AWS. So the next slide, please. Let me turn to reliability. And this is publicly available data. AWS is 7 times more reliable than Azure and GCP. And this turns out to matter to customers in a big way. But the question is, why is that? And I want to explore a little behind the numbers of why the AWS platform is more reliable. If you can go to the next slide, please. And in fact, this slide is actually already out of date. So we have this concept of a region. We actually now have 24 regions. We just opened our newest one in Milan. And we actually have 76 availability zones and 200 points of presence. And this means we've got an incredibly low latency, high performance, reliable, and redundant data center architecture. And I don't even have time to go into the full data center architecture, but I would urge you to explore a deep dive in that. But there's one key point inside of that, which is the availability zones. If you go to the next slide, please. So within a region, say North America, we'll have an AZ availability zone. And within that, there's at least 2 data centers within every AZ, and usually there's 3. And within that AZ, those 3 data centers are redundant and asynchronous replicated. So what that means is you're able to get that level of reliability than other cloud platforms. That's what's really different, is this notion of AZs. If you go to the next slide, please. So when you look inside of Azure's platform, they talk about how many regions they've got, but the reality is they only have 10 AZs. We have actually 76 now. And some of their AZs only have limited services. And we've had these concepts for almost a decade, this notion of how we've designed this data center architecture. Azure just introduced this in 2018. And so we have a much more mature concept of this data center architecture, but this is fundamentally why our platform is more reliable. And that's not even taking into account just how we route traffic and the networking capabilities and all of our direct connections, et cetera. But the cornerstone and foundation of the difference between is Azure can often be a region is a single data center. For us, you have a region, then an AZ. AZ has at least 3 data centers inside of it, and most regions have multiple AZs inside of them. Next slide, please. And we just continue to expand our footprint. So we have more regions coming. We just opened Milan, Spain is coming down the road, and we're going to continue to invest in this capability over the long term to support customers' workloads needs globally. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me just kind of highlight our pace of innovation, particularly for Windows workloads. And we've been innovating. I'm really closely attached to the Windows EC2 product teams at AWS. I work with them closely, and they are constantly iterating to make the experience better. We recognize we have gaps, but we are heads down trying to improve the experience, and have really come a long way to make Windows workloads run. And in fact, we're running twice as many Windows workloads as any other cloud provider today. So customers are choosing AWS for this. And within this, excuse me, and we tried to be, when SQL Server 2019 came out, we had it out, I think, the next day that it was launched. And this is an area across .NET, SQL Server, Windows Server, Active Directory. We have dedicated teams just building services to support that. I think I saw a question in the chat. Let's see, am I seeing the question there? How is this different from Azure Availability Zone? Okay, so the Azure Availability Zone is the same concept as the AWS Availability Zones. It's just that what I'm pointing out here is we have 76 and they have 10. And that means we've got significantly greater redundancy built into our data center platform. And we've had them for almost a decade, and Azure's had them for about 2 years. So we believe the maturity of them is substantially ahead of where Azure is. All right, we can go to the next slide, please. So let me turn to just running SQL on AWS. You heard in the stories, we had DB Best, who's a enterprise database consulting company, wrote 2 blogs, one for Azure, one for AWS, that showed the best price performance running SQL Server in the cloud. And ZK Research took those blogs and compared the results from DB Best to show an apples-to-apple comparison. And ZK Research pointed out that SQL Server consistently showed a 2 times better price performance using the Hammer DB, a TPC-like benchmark, compared to Azure. And the first chart shows the cost of 1 billion transactions per month. Smaller is better, AWS is less expensive. And then ZK Research dove into the performance of SQL Server. And again, SQL Server outperformed a SQL Server on Azure when they looked at it from a transaction per minute perspective, almost 3 times as much. And you might have seen some of the ads from Azure saying AWS is 5 times more expensive. What's really important to understand is in those examples, they're assuming customer has software assurance on SQL. Well, they had to pay for software assurance, so they don't actually include that cost of software assurance in their pricing comparison, which unfortunately is misleading for customers, and that's really driving that price delta that they see when you compare them license included. It's really not the case. So if you go to the next slide, what's important to highlight, and you saw this in the story from a couple of the customers, is that, look, relational databases are not the only game in town anymore. The world's shifted. And what's happened is, as the cost of storage and compute has changed, a new generation of applications that have emerged, creating new requirements for databases. These applications need databases to store terabytes or petabytes of new data, different types of data, to provide access to that data with millisecond latency. And so our worldview is that customers should be thinking about a purpose-built database for their application, not just assuming that a one relational database type is the only way to go. And so we just have a fundamentally different worldview than Azure does in this space. And we've got more options around database types than any other cloud provider. If you want to run SQL on AWS, it runs perfectly fine. In fact, it runs amazing. And in fact, we have self-managed SQL, and we have SQL as a managed database through our SQL RDS offering. But we also, more importantly, give you that option to entirely move off SQL if you'd like to. If you want to stay in SQL, no problem. But if you want to get off SQL, we have an off-ramp for you to do that. And you notice in several of the stories, they first move their SQL to AWS, then they move to Amazon Aurora to achieve better performance at a lower cost. So really important point that we can support your journey both in the short term and in the long term from a database perspective. Now, next slide, please. Now, I won't have time to go into all of the services just on Windows, but there's a couple ones that as you're thinking about migrating Windows workloads to AWS, it's really important you know about. One of them is something called License Manager, which enables you to, if you're going to BYOL licenses to AWS, Oracle, Microsoft, IBM, SAP, then you're able to actually manage them through a free service called License Manager. So you want to be aware of that. We've also just recently launched some new capabilities around dedicated hosts that make them more cloud-like. There's some auto scaling functionality inside of them, and you can also buy Windows Server license included on our new dedicated hosts. We have a program called EMP, which I'm going to talk about in another slide. That's about how we support 2008 workloads. We just recently launched our SQL Server failover cluster instances on FSX for Windows. We have something called our Launch Wizard, which is a guided way of sizing and configuring your resources on AWS. Image Builder simplifies the creation and maintenance or validation of your Windows or Linux images. A new single sign-on service that you can centrally manage access to multiple AWS accounts. An EC2 Compute Optimizer, which helps you choose the optimal instance sizes to reduce your costs. So there are some real Windows-specific services that you want to get to know or talk to a partner if a partner's helping you do a migration. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. I want to now pivot to modernization for a minute. So if you go to the next slide, please. And, again, AWS really offers the opportunity for customers to really solve for that on-premise technical debt, move to AWS, move to an operating expense, and lower your costs. But at the same time, the ability to modernize off Microsoft is a real common use case that we're seeing a lot of. And the design pattern is following a pretty simple pathway. So if you go to the next slide, please. What we're seeing is obviously with .NET end of life, everything is moving to .NET Core. And when you move to .NET Core, that's enabling customers to move to Linux servers, or we're seeing customers move to serverless entirely, or they're moving to containers. So really popular motion by re-architecting your legacy .NET applications to .NET Core. So that pathway to Linux, to serverless, to containers on the application side, we're seeing just tremendous work in that space and many, many customers adopting that. As you heard in these customer stories, we have very strong momentum of SQL Server on Windows to Aurora, but we are seeing some growth in SQL Server to Linux as well as even SQL Server to Postgres. And in fact, I've even seen cases where they move from SQL Server to an S3 data lake on AWS. So these pathways really give you lots of options should you want to modernize completely away from Microsoft technology. Next slide, please. And in the container world, AWS today is running about 81% of the containers in the world, and 80% of them are running on AWS, and we actually have 82% of Kubernetes are running on AWS. So we're really investing in ECS and EKS and supporting Windows so that we can help customers continue to adopt this technology to create scale and make it easier to deploy and manage their applications. Next slide, please. And just the momentum from SQL Server to Aurora is tremendous. Dow Jones is a really good example. They have saved 50% of their database costs by moving off of SQL Server. 3M is doing it, Expedia is doing this, Pierce and Ryanair. You heard about Visma earlier in the story. So it's a very proven use case for us. We've got a great tool called a schema conversion tool that can analyze your database and help you determine look at your stored procedures and understand the complexity of converting your database and refactoring it to Aurora or to Postgres or something of that nature. All right, next slide, please. I'm gonna just talk about a couple of ways to get started. So if you're in an on-premise situation and you haven't really made that big adoption to AWS, I wanna talk a little bit about how to get started. So you can click on the next slide. So what we advise is the best place to get started would be to do an assessment. And we have a couple of different tools that we can do at no cost to you, do an assessment of your on-premise. We can inventory your infrastructure estate, and we can provide you a financial analysis that will right-size that infrastructure on AWS, inclusive of your Microsoft licensing position. And in most cases, we find there's some level of BYOL licenses, like SQL Server or Windows Server they may own. We'll help you determine what entitlements you can bring them to AWS, or you'll buy license included, or you might want to do dedicated hosts. And so through our assessment, we can help you understand that. And then we have a whole set of planning tools to help you plan a migration. And then we've got a whole suite of actual migration tools to simplify it. Cloud Undo is our core migration tool. It's an agent. We also have a agentless server migration service, a database migration service, and a whole set of operations and optimization services to help you save money and track and monitor your workloads. So again, I would, if you don't have experience in this, our recommendation is reach out to one of our AWS Microsoft competency partners. They can help you navigate this journey. So we've got a very proven, well-architected best practices framework on how to do all of this, and the AWS Migration Hub is how you can monitor your migration as it's taking place. And just to put in context this assessment that I'm referring to, next slide, please, is we are seeing, we've done hundreds of these over the last 12 months. And the average cost savings we've seen compared to on-premise is 36%. I've seen cost savings of 50, 60% with customers, because what we always find is they're not optimized on-premise. They're underutilized. And so we're able to consolidate infrastructure, right-size the instances for the workloads of your application, and right-size your licensing. Take all of those factors into consideration to give you this optimized, what we call right-sized infrastructure on AWS. And so we got real data, it's real savings, and we got lots of customer testimonials to what this is helping them out. Next slide, please. The next one is we have this service called EMP, and this is a software platform. It's actually a packaging software. And what we're able to do is that we can actually package your legacy 2008 workload applications where you may not have the documentation, and with no code changes, we can put a wrapper and package the application, abstract it from the underlying server OS, Windows Server 2008, and we can upgrade that Windows Server OS with no code changes to your application. So this is really solving customers that have legacy 2008 that's sitting behind a firewall, or they might be considering to migrate to Azure and to get free 3 years of support, but it still entails a complex migration. What we'll do is we'll package your application, then we migrate it to AWS, and no code changes to your application. It's a very cool technology. It's for specific types of applications, and our solution architects can help you navigate whether your application's a fit for this service or not. But it's a very compelling technology. And it's a service that we announced last November at our reInvent conference. Okay, next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, most customers, as it relates to Windows workloads, use partners. 68% of the time, our migrations involve a partner. So we've got what are called Windows service delivery partners throughout the world, available to help you migrate your workloads and modernize your workloads to AWS. Next slide. We've also got what we call competency partners. These partners have a next higher level of expertise to help migrate workloads to AWS. Again, we have these in all geos around the world. So go ahead to the next slide. So how you get started is, if you want to learn more information, go to our website, amazon.com/Windows. We have a lot of documentation and information about running Microsoft workloads on AWS. If you want to find a partner in your local geography, go to the link you'll see here on the screen, and you can find our partner solutions that will take you to our Microsoft competency partners. If you have a salesperson, contact AWS, contact your rep, and they can help you get started. And would really encourage you to take advantage of our no-cost OLA assessment. And your salesperson can help you get that process, or if you go through a partner, they can also help get that process started with you, and we can help quantify your environment. So with that, next slide, we're going to turn it to Q&A, and we're going to give it a couple of minutes here and see if we have any questions in the window here. Okay, so we often hear that because it's a Windows workload, like many customers' immediate perception is, oh, I should just go to Azure. And I hope what you've learned today is that it's important to really give AWS consideration for these Windows workloads. We've got the proven expertise, way more services than Azure's platform, tremendous performance and reliability. And I think you'll be surprised at our capabilities. We have a full stack support for .NET applications, Windows Server, SQL Server, Active Directory, customer environments. And so we really would love to get your feedback and see how we can help you in your cloud journey. All right, let's see here. I'm not seeing any additional questions I'm going to give it another minute. If you have a question, feel free to post it into the chat window. We'll give it just a minute to see if any questions show up here. All right, well, we covered a lot of ground today. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining today's webinar. Have a great day and be safe. Goodbye.